Stepmother, I can't sleep. The sound of Alex's voice cut through the stillness of the room, soft but urgent. I stirred, the haze of sleep clinging to me as I blinked up at the shadowy figure standing in my doorway. My heart leapt into my throat, a jolt of panic racing through me. What is he doing here? Why now? Alex? What's wrong? I asked, my voice raspy from sleep. He hesitated, his broad shoulders tense, his hands fidgeting at his sides. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated his face just enough for me to see the conflict etched there. I can't stop thinking about something. About you. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat up slowly, the sheets pooling around my waist as I tried to make sense of what he was saying. Me? What do you mean? Alex took a step closer, his bare feet silent on the carpet. His voice was low, trembling with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, desire, or maybe both. It's hard to explain. I've felt this way for a while, but I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know if I should tell you. My mind raced, scrambling to put the pieces together. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not like this. Alex, whatever it is, we can talk about it. Just tell me what's going on. He stared at me, his eyes burning with an intensity that made my breath catch. I think I'm in love with you, stepmother. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around me as his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. No. This isn't real. This can't be real. Alex, that's not love, I said carefully, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. You're confused, that's all. It's just admiration or… It's not just admiration, he interrupted, his voice firm now, resolute. I've felt this way for years. You're the only one who really gets me, who sees me. I don't know how else to explain it. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that this was some kind of twisted misunderstanding. But the look in his eyes, raw, vulnerable, desperate, stopped me. My chest ached, a tangled mess of emotions I couldn't begin to unravel. Alex, this isn't right. You know that, don't you? He stepped closer now, close enough that I could see the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, the way his chest rose and fell with his rapid breaths. I don't care if it's right or not, he whispered. I just know how I feel, and I can't keep pretending I don't. The air between us was charged, thick with tension that made it hard to breathe. I could feel the heat radiating off him, could smell the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the warmth of his skin. My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed in my ears. This is wrong. This is so wrong. But the way he looked at me, it stirred something inside me, something I didn't want to acknowledge. Alex, we can't, I started, but my voice trailed off, the words catching in my throat. He was so close now, his body hovering just inches from mine. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the intensity of his need, and it terrified me. What if I don't want to stop? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His hand reached out, trembling as he brushed a strand of hair from my face. His touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. What if I can't? I swallowed hard, my mind spinning as I tried to find the words to stop this, to put an end to it before it went too far. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it either. The lines between right and wrong blurred, the boundaries I'd always clung to slipping away. Alex, his name slipped from my lips, a plea and a warning all at once. But before I could say more, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss so soft, so tentative, it broke something inside me. I should have pushed him away. I should have told him no. But instead, I found myself kissing him back, my hands trembling as they gripped the fabric of his shirt. The kiss deepened, his tongue sliding against mine with a hunger that matched the fire building low in my belly. This is wrong. This is so wrong. The thought echoed in my mind, but it was drowned out by the pounding of my heart, the desperate need that flooded my senses. His hands were everywhere, touching, exploring, claiming. I moaned into his mouth, my body betraying me as I arched into him, craving more. He pulled back just enough to look into my eyes, his breath ragged, his chest heaving. Stepmother, I need you. Please. The words sent a jolt through me, a mix of shame and desire that left me trembling. I knew I should stop this, knew I should put an end to it before it went any further. But the way he looked at me, the way his hands felt on my skin, it was too much. Okay? I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop it. And then he was on me, his lips crashing against mine with a desperation that left me breathless. His hands fumbled with the hem of my nightgown, pushing it up as his fingers found the wet heat between my thighs. "Alex," I gasped, my hips bucking against his touch. We can't. We can," he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with desire. "Just this once. Please, stepmother." And in that moment, I couldn't think, couldn't reason, couldn't do anything but give in to the storm raging inside me. My hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as his fingers teased me, driving me wild. "Yes," I breathed, the word a surrender to the madness that had taken hold of us both. "Yes." He didn't need any more encouragement. In one swift motion, he positioned himself between my legs, his hardness pressing against me. I sucked in a sharp breath, my heart pounding as he paused, his eyes searching mine for permission. I nodded, my stomach twisting with a mix of fear and anticipation. "Do it," I whispered. And then he was inside me, filling me with a heat that made my head spin. I moaned, my nails digging into his back as he began to move, his hips driving into me with a rhythm that left me gasping. "Stepmother," he groaned, his voice rough with need. "You feel so good." I couldn't speak, couldn't think, my body completely consumed by the sensations coursing through me. The pleasure was overwhelming, a tidal wave that threatened to sweep me away. "Alex," I gasped, my legs wrapping around him as I urged him deeper. "Don't stop, please." He didn't. His pace quickened, his thrusts growing more frantic as we both spiraled toward the edge. The room was filled with the sound of our ragged breaths, the slick slide of our bodies, the creak of the bed beneath us. And then it happened, that moment of pure, blinding ecstasy as we both came undone, our cries mingling in the darkness. For a long moment, we just lay there, tangled together, our hearts racing as we tried to catch our breaths. The reality of what we'd done slowly began to sink in, the weight of it pressing down on me like a lead blanket. What have we done? I thought, my stomach churning with guilt. What have I done? Alex shifted beside me, his arms snaking around my waist as he pulled me closer. His lips brushed against my temple in a tender kiss that only made the guilt worse. "I love you, stepmother," he murmured, his voice soft, almost reverent. Tears welled in my eyes as I turned to look at him, my heart breaking under the weight of everything we'd just done. "I love you too, Alex," I whispered, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The lines we'd crossed couldn't be uncrossed, the damage we'd done couldn't be undone. And as I lay there in the darkness, with my stepson's arms wrapped around me, I couldn't help but wonder, what happens now? The room was silent except for the soft sound of our breathing, tangled together in the aftermath of what we'd done. My mind raced, a whirlwind of guilt, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name, something warm and forbidden that stirred low in my stomach. Alex's hand rested on my hip, his fingers tracing absent circles on my skin, sending shivers through me. This is wrong, I thought, so wrong, but my body didn't seem to care. It responded to his touch like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Stepmother," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of vulnerability and desire. His breath was warm against my neck, and I felt his lips brush against my skin. God, why does this feel so good? My fingers twitched, wanting to reach for him, to pull him closer, but I held them still, clenched into fists at my sides. "Alex," I said, my voice barely audible. We shouldn't." Even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow, like I didn't fully believe them. He shifted closer, his chest pressing against my back, and I could feel the hardness of him, the proof of his desire. My breath hitched, and I bit my lip to stifle a moan. "Stop this," I urged myself, "stop it now." But my body betrayed me, arching slightly into his touch. "Do you really want me to stop?" he asked, his voice low, almost pleading. His hand moved from my hip to my stomach, his palm pressing flat against my skin, and I could feel the heat radiating from him. My heart pounded in my chest, and I closed my eyes, trying to think of anything but the way his touch made me feel. But it was impossible. All I could think about was him, his scent, his warmth, the way his body fit so perfectly against mine. I don't know," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. It was the truth. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. The lines had blurred, the boundaries erased, and I was lost in a sea of confusion and desire. His hand moved lower, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Alex," I whispered, my voice trembling, "this is a wrong." "Is it?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with something darker, more insistent. His fingers slipped beneath the waistband of my panties, and I gasped, my body betraying me completely. Does it feel wrong, stepmother? He pressed, his lips brushing against my ear. Or, does it feel right? His fingers brushed against me, and I shuddered, my hips jerking involuntarily. God, Alex. I moaned, the sound escaping before I could stop it. My resolve was crumbling, piece by piece, and I could feel myself giving in to him, to this forbidden desire that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. His fingers moved with purpose, teasing and stroking, and I felt myself unraveling, my mind going blank as pleasure consumed me. Let me make you feel good, stepmother, he whispered, his voice thick with need. His other hand moved to my breast, his fingers brushing over my nipple, and I gasped, my back arching into his touch. You deserve this, he murmured, his lips trailing down my neck. You deserve to feel good. I wanted to protest, to push him away and tell him we couldn't do this, that it was wrong, that it was a mistake, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I reached back, my fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer as his lips found mine. The kiss was deep, desperate, filled with a hunger that mirrored my own. His tongue slid against mine, and I moaned into his mouth, my body burning with need. Please, I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop it. I didn't even know what I was asking for, but he seemed to understand. His hand moved faster, his fingers driving me closer and closer to the edge, and I clung to him, my nails digging into his skin as pleasure coiled tight in my belly. Let go, stepmother, he urged, his voice rough with desire. Just let go. His words were like a spark, igniting something deep inside me, and I came undone, my body trembling as waves of pleasure crashed over me. I cried out, his name spilling from my lips, and he held me tight, his arms wrapping around me as I rode out the aftershocks. When it was over, I collapsed back against him, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, shame, but also something else, something warm and electric that I couldn't ignore. Alex's arms tightened around me, and he pressed a soft kiss to the back of my neck. I love you, stepmother, he whispered, his voice filled with a sincerity that made my heart ache. I've always loved you. Tears pricked at my eyes, and I turned to face him, my hand reaching up to cup his cheek. I love you too, Alex, I said, my voice trembling. More than I should, I thought, but I didn't say it. Instead, I leaned in, my lips brushing against his in a soft, tender kiss. It was different from before, slower, more intimate, and I could feel the intensity of his emotions in the way he responded, his hands moving to my hips as he pulled me closer. We stayed like that for a long time, lost in each other, the rest of the world fading away. But even as I kissed him, even as my body responded to his touch, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the back of my mind. This is dangerous, I thought, so dangerous. But as his hands moved over my body, igniting fires wherever they touched, I couldn't bring myself to care. For now, in this moment, nothing else mattered but him. The room was still, the air thick with the weight of what had just happened. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, Alex's arms wrapped around me, his breath warm against my skin. His words echoed in my mind, I love you, stepmother, and though I had said it back, there was no denying the unease that twisted in my gut. This is wrong, I thought, but why does it feel so right? Alex shifted beside me, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my arm. I could feel the tension in his body, the way he was waiting for me to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the storm of emotions raging inside me. What have we done? What does this mean for us? Stepmother, he said finally, his voice soft but urgent. I've been thinking. I turned my head to look at him, my heart skipping a beat at the intensity in his eyes. What now? I wanted to ask, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded, urging him to continue. I don't want to lose you, he said, his voice trembling. And I'm scared that if people find out about us, they'll take you away from me. That they'll make us feel like it's wrong. His words sent a shiver down my spine. It is wrong, a voice in my head whispered, but I pushed it away, focusing instead on the earnestness in his expression. Alex, I started, my voice barely above a whisper. We can't let anyone find out. We have to be careful. He shook his head, his grip on me tightening. I don't want to be careful. I don't want to hide. I just want, he trailed off, his eyes searching mine. I want to be with you, without feeling like we're doing something wrong. My breath hitched, and I felt a pang of guilt at the longing in his voice. How could I let it come to this? I thought, but even as I questioned myself, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. The way my body reacted to his touch, the way my heart raced when he looked at me, it was undeniable. What are you saying? I asked, my voice trembling. He took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving mine. I'm saying, maybe we should leave. Just the two of us. Start over somewhere no one knows us. Somewhere we can be together without feeling ashamed. My eyes widened, and for a moment, I couldn't find the words to respond. Leave? Run away together? It was crazy, reckless, dangerous, and yet the idea sent a thrill through me that I couldn't ignore. But what about your life? Your future? Alex, I said slowly, my voice shaking, that's not realistic. You have your whole life ahead of you. I can't let you throw that away for me. He reached up, his hand cupping my cheek, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. You're my life, stepmother. You're all I care about. I don't want a future without you. Tears pricked at my eyes, and I turned my head, burying my face in his chest. His heartbeat was steady against my ear, a comforting rhythm that only made the turmoil inside me worse. How did we get here? I asked myself, but there was no answer. Only the undeniable truth that we were here, and there was no going back. I don't know, Alex, I whispered, my voice breaking. I'm scared. Scared of losing you. Scared of what people will think. Scared of what this means for us. He pulled me closer, his lips brushing against the top of my head. I know it's scary, he said softly. But we're in this together, right? You promised. I nodded, the memory of my words from earlier that night flooding back. We'll handle it together. I had meant it then, and I meant it now. Even if the reality of what we were facing was more complicated than I could have imagined. Right, I said, my voice barely audible. Together. We lay there in silence for a long time, the weight of his suggestion hanging in the air between us. My mind raced, torn between the fear of what we were considering and the undeniable pull I felt toward him. Could we really do this? Could we really leave everything behind and start over? Finally, Alex broke the silence, his voice soft but determined. Just think about it, okay? I'm not saying we have to decide right now, but just think about it. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Think about it. It was a simple request, but it felt like so much more. It felt like a choice that could change everything. Okay, I whispered, my voice trembling. I'll think about it. He pressed a soft kiss to the top of my head, his arms tightening around me. I love you, stepmother, he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that made my heart ache. No matter what happens, I'll always love you. Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I turned my face into his chest, letting the warmth of his embrace soothe the chaos inside me. I love you too, Alex, I thought, more than I should, more than I ever thought possible. But as I lay there in his arms, the words lingered in the back of my mind, unspoken and heavy. What have we done? What have we become? And more importantly, where do we go from here? Alex's fingers traced patterns on my back, his touch soothing and electric at the same time. We'll figure it out, he murmured, as if reading my thoughts. Together. I nodded, my tears dampening his skin. Together, I repeated, the word feeling both like a promise and a warning. But as his hand moved lower, his touch becoming more deliberate, the thoughts in my mind began to blur. The fear, the guilt, the uncertainty, they all faded into the background, replaced by the heat that was building between us. His lips found mine, and I kissed him back, my body responding to his touch in a way that felt both familiar and new. Alex, I whispered against his mouth, my voice trembling with need. He pulled back just enough to look into my eyes, his gaze filled with a mix of desire and something deeper, something that made my heart ache. Tell me, he said, his voice low and urgent. Tell me what you want. I hesitated, my mind racing even as my body screamed for more. This is wrong, I thought so wrong. But as his hand slid between my legs, his touch igniting a fire that I couldn't ignore, the words spilled out before I could stop them. You. I breathed, my voice barely audible. I want you. His lips crashed into mine, his kiss desperate and hungry, and I let myself get lost in the sensation, the heat, the need. Forget everything else, I thought as his body pressed against mine. Just for tonight. But even as I gave in to the passion, even as I let myself forget the world outside, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the back of my mind. This is dangerous, I thought, so dangerous. And yet, as his hands moved over my body, as his lips trailed kisses down my neck, I couldn't bring myself to care. For now, in this moment, nothing else mattered but him. "Stepmother," he whispered, his voice rough with need. I kissed him, cutting off his words, my hands tingling in his hair. "Don't talk," I murmured against his lips. "Just be with me." He nodded, his eyes dark with desire, and then his hands were everywhere, his touch igniting fires that I couldn't ignore. I let myself get lost in the sensation, in the heat, in the need. Forget everything else, I thought, just for tonight. But even as I lost myself in him, even as my body responded to his touch in ways that felt both familiar and new, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the back of my mind. This is dangerous, I thought, so dangerous. And yet, as his hands moved over my body, as his lips trailed kisses down my neck, I couldn't bring myself to care. For now, in this moment, nothing else mattered but him. "Alex," I whispered, my voice trembling with need. He looked at me, his eyes dark with desire. "Yes." I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I love you," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. He smiled, a soft, tender smile that made my heart ache. "I love you too, stepmother," he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that made my chest tighten. "More than anything." And as he kissed me again, as his hands moved over my body in ways that made me forget everything else, I let myself believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, we could make this work. The door creaked open, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Alex and I were entangled on the couch, his lips pressed against mine, his hands roaming over my body with a fervor that left me breathless. The sound of the door shattered the fragile trance we had been in, and I jolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. "Dad." Alex's voice was shaky, filled with a mix of guilt and fear as he pulled away from me, his eyes wide with panic. I turned to see my husband standing in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. The suitcase he had been carrying slipped from his grasp, thudding heavily against the floor. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice was low, almost a growl, but the anger in his eyes was unmistakable. I could feel the heat of shame rising to my cheeks, my mind scrambling for some kind of explanation, some way to explain the unexplainable. "John, I began, but my voice faltered, the words catching in my throat. How could I possibly justify what he had just walked in on? How could I explain the way I had felt in Alex's arms, the way I had let myself succumb to something so wrong, yet so intoxicating? John took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Don't," he barked, cutting me off before I could continue. "Don't you dare try to explain this to me. I know what I saw." Alex stood up, his body tense, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Dad, it's not what you think," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to my ears. John's gaze shifted to him, and I could see the pain and betrayal etched in his expression. "Not what I think," John repeated, his voice rising with each word. "I come home early to surprise my wife, and I find her, my stepson. What the F is wrong with you two?" I flinched at the venom in his voice, my stomach twisting with guilt. "John, please," I pleaded, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let us explain." "Explain?" he spat, taking another step closer. "Explain how my wife and my stepson could be. He couldn't finish the sentence, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and disgust. His chest heaved with the effort of controlling his temper, and I could see the struggle in his eyes as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. Alex took a tentative step forward, his voice trembling but determined. "Dad, I know this looks bad, but—" "Shut up," John snapped, cutting him off. "I don't want to hear another word out of your mouth. You've done enough damage already." He turned to me, his eyes burning with a fury that made my blood run cold. "And you? How could you, Diana? How could you let this happen?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. What could I say? That I had tried to resist, that I had tried to push Alex away but couldn't? That I had been just as much a victim of my own desires as he had been? It all sounded like excuses, even to myself. John's gaze darted between the two of us, his breathing ragged. "I don't even know who you are anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Either of you. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of John's words pressing down on us like a physical force. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. This was my fault, all of it, and I couldn't even begin to imagine the pain I had caused him. John, I'm so sorry, I finally managed to say, my voice cracking with emotion. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted any of this to happen. His laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. And yet here we are, he said, his voice cold. Here we are, with my wife and my stepson, my own stepson, betraying me in the worst possible way. Alex stepped forward, his face pale but determined. Dad, I know it's unforgivable, but I need you to understand, I love her. I've always loved her, and I couldn't keep it hidden anymore. John's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, he looked as if he had been struck. You what? He stammered, his voice barely audible. I love her, Alex repeated, his voice steady despite the turmoil I could see in his eyes. I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel. John stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he grabbed Alex by the collar, shoving him roughly against the wall. You don't get to say that, he snarled, his face inches from Alex's. You don't get to talk about love when you've just destroyed this family. John, stop. I cried, rushing forward to pull him off Alex. But he was too strong, his anger giving him a strength I couldn't match. He kept Alex pinned against the wall, his grip like a vice. You're my stepson, John growled, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. My stepson.
How could you do this to me?
To us. Alex's face was pale, but he didn't struggle. He just stared at his father, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. I didn't want to hurt you, he said quietly. But I can't keep pretending, Dad. I can't keep denying who I am. John's grip tightened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to hit him. But then, just as suddenly as the rage had come, it seemed to drain out of him. He released Alex, taking a step back, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world had just settled on them. Get out, he said, his voice hollow. Both of you. I can't even look at you right now. John, please, I begged, reaching out to him, but he flinched away from my touch. His eyes met mine, and in them, I saw a pain so deep it made my heart ache. Just go, he said, his voice breaking.
Please.
Just go. Alex grabbed my hand, his grip tight and urgent. Come on, stepmother, he said, pulling me toward the door. I hesitated, my eyes still on John, but he had turned away, his back to us, as he stared out the window. John, I started, but Alex's pull was insistent, and I let myself be led out of the room, my heart heavy with guilt and regret. The door closed behind us with a soft click, leaving us standing in the hallway, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us like a suffocating blanket. I turned to Alex, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. But before I could say anything, he pulled me into his arms, his body trembling against mine. I'm so sorry, stepmother, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I didn't mean for this to happen. I know, I said, my own voice trembling.
I know, Alex.
But we can't take it back now. He held me tighter, his breath warm against my neck, and I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into his embrace. But even as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just crossed a line from which there was no return. The sound of John's voice echoed in my mind, filled with pain and betrayal, and I knew that things would never be the same again. The silence in the house was deafening as Diana and Alex stepped out into the cool night air. The weight of John's discovery hung heavy between them, a storm of guilt and fear brewing in their chests. Diana's hand trembled in Alex's as they walked, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts she couldn't fully process. What now? She kept asking herself. Where do we go from here? Alex tightened his grip on her hand, as if sensing her turmoil. Stepmother, he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. We'll figure this out. Together. She glanced at him, her heart aching at the sight of his earnest expression. He's just a boy, she thought, my boy. How did we end up here? But there was no denying the fire in his eyes, the way he looked at her as if she were his entire world. It was both overwhelming and intoxicating. They reached the car, and Alex opened the door for her, his touch lingering on her arm as she slid into the passenger seat. He got in beside her, but instead of starting the engine, he just sat there, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. "Alex," Diana said gently, placing a hand on his knee. "We need to talk about this. About what just happened." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and desperation. "I know, stepmother. I don't know what to say. I love you. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it." And after tonight, after what he saw, his voice trailed off, and he looked away, his jaw tightening. Diana's heart ached for him, for both of them. She reached out, cupping his face in her hand and turning him back to her. "Alex, I love you too. But this is more complicated than we can handle right now. We need to think about what this means for all of us, not just you and me." He nodded, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. I don't want to lose you." "You won't," she said firmly, though even as the words left her mouth, she wondered if they were true. "How can we keep this from destroying everything we've built?" The sound of the front door slamming shut made them both jump. Diana turned to see John standing on the porch, his broad frame silhouetted against the light streaming from the house. He was still dressed in his suit, his tie loosened and his hair disheveled. The anger in his posture was palpable, but there was something else in his eyes, something dark and unspoken. "John," Diana whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked down the steps and toward the car, his movements deliberate and slow. Diana's heart pounded in her chest as he approached, and she instinctively reached for the door handle. But before she could open it, he was there, his face pressed against the window, his eyes locked on hers. "Get out of the car," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "John, please," she pleaded. "Let's just
Get out
of
the
car." Alex's hand tightened on the steering wheel, but he didn't say anything. Diana glanced at him, her mind racing, before she slowly opened the door and stepped out. The cool night air hit her like a slap, but it was John's presence that made her shiver. He stepped back, giving her space, but his eyes never left hers. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold and measured. "All of us." Diana swallowed hard, her throat dry. "John, Not here," he interrupted, cutting her off with a sharp gesture. "Inside.
now."
She nodded, her legs feeling like lead as she followed him back to the house. Alex got out of the car and followed behind, his footsteps heavy with uncertainty. The three of them walked back inside, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. John led them to the living room, where he stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed over his chest. Diana and Alex stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, their hands brushing against each other but not daring to hold on. "Sit," John said, his voice brooking no argument. They did as they were told, sitting side by side on the couch, their knees touching. Diana couldn't bring herself to look at John, her eyes fixed on the floor as she waited for him to speak. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, finally, John let out a deep breath and said, "Do you have any idea how much you've destroyed tonight? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Diana flinched at the harshness in his tone, but she couldn't find the words to defend herself. Alex, however, leaned forward, his voice trembling with emotion. "Dad, I know this is wrong, but I can't help how I feel. I love her. I always have." John's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Diana thought he might lunge at Alex. But instead, he just shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You love her? You think what you're feeling is love. You have no idea what love is." Alex's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. John turned to Diana, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "And you? How could you let this happen? How could you let him? "John," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It did." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he looked away, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had just been placed on them. "You think you're the only ones with secrets?" he said, his voice so low they almost didn't hear him. Diana's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" John turned back to her, his eyes dark and filled with something she couldn't quite place. "I mean, I've been carrying my own burden for years. Something I never wanted you to know." Diana's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. "John, what are you talking about?" He hesitated, his jaw clenched, as if he were fighting with himself. Then finally he said, "I've been involved with someone else. For a long time now." The words hit Diana like a punch to the gut. She stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. What? John's expression was grim, but there was no hint of regret in his eyes. It started years ago. A business trip. It was just supposed to be a one-time thing, but it grew into something more. I never wanted to hurt you, Diana. But I couldn't stop. Diana felt as if the ground had just been ripped out from under her. She looked at Alex, who was staring at John with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Dad, how could you? John's gaze shifted to Alex, and for the first time, Diana saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. I didn't plan for this, Alex. None of us did. But you need to understand that love, it's complicated. It's messy. And sometimes, it leads us to places we never thought we'd go. Diana's mind was reeling, her heart torn between the betrayal she felt and the realization that she wasn't the only one with secrets. She looked at John, her voice trembling as she asked, "Who is it?
Who have you been with?"
John hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he were weighing his words. Then, finally, he said, "It's someone you know. Someone who's been in our lives for a long time." Diana's heart sank as the realization hit her. Not her. John's words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating Diana. Her chest tightened, and her fingers dug into the fabric of her dress as she whispered, "It's her, isn't it? My best friend, Emily." John's silence was confirmation enough. He didn't need to say it. The way he avoided her gaze told her everything. Emily, the woman she had confided in, the one who had been there through every high and low of her marriage. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife, and Diana felt her knees weaken beneath her. Alex stood frozen, his eyes darting between his parents. "Emily? You're Emily? Dad, how? How could you?" John's voice was low, almost pleading. "It's not something I planned, Alex. It just happened. She understood me in ways your mother didn't." Diana's hands balled into fists, her nails cutting into her palms. Understood him? Was that supposed to justify it? Her vision blurred with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall.
No.
She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not now. Not when her mind was already racing, plotting, scheming. She took a step forward, her voice cold and steady. "You've been sleeping with my best friend. The woman I trusted more than anyone. And you think that's okay? That you can just drop this on us and expect us to what? Forgive you?" John's shoulders slumped, but Diana didn't care. She didn't care about his guilt, his remorse, or whatever half-baked apology he might try to offer. All she cared about was the fire burning in her chest, the need for revenge that was quickly consuming her. She turned to Alex, her eyes locking with his. There was something unspoken between them, a silent understanding that passed in the space of a heartbeat. He's hurt us both. And now, she thought, her mind twisting into darker, more dangerous territory. Now it's our turn. "Alex," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "we're leaving." Alex hesitated, his gaze flickering to his father before settling back on her. "Where are we going?" Diana's lips curved into a faint, dangerous smile. "Somewhere private. We have things to discuss." John stepped forward, his hand outstretched as if to stop them. "Diana, wait. We need to talk about this." She cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Oh, we'll talk.
But not now.
Now, I need to think. And when I'm done thinking, well, you'll see." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed Alex's hand and pulled him toward the door. His fingers tightened around hers, and she could feel the heat of his skin, the tension in his grip. They stepped out into the cool night air, and Diana didn't stop walking until they were around the corner, out of sight of the house. Alex finally broke the silence, his voice quiet but urgent. "Stepmother, what's going on? What are you planning?" She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and something darker, something primal. "He hurt us, Alex. Both of us. And now I want to hurt him back. I want him to feel the same betrayal, the same pain." Alex's breath hitched, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to protest, to argue that it was wrong, but there was something else there, too. A hunger.
A need.
She could feel it radiating off him, and it only fueled her own desire. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Diana stepped closer, her hand reaching up to cup his cheek. "You already know, Alex. You've always known." His eyes widened, and she could see the realization dawning on him. "Stepmother, Sure," she interrupted, her thumb brushing over his lips. "Don't think. Just feel." Her lips met his in a searing kiss, and for a moment, Alex froze, his body stiff with shock. But then he melted into it, his arms wrapping around her waist as he deepened the kiss. It was wrong, so wrong, but neither of them cared. Not when the taste of each other was so intoxicating, so addictive. When they finally pulled apart, Diana's breathing was ragged, her heart racing. "This is how we hurt him," she said, her voice husky with desire. "This is how we make him pay." Alex's eyes were dark, filled with a need that mirrored her own. "But what if he finds out? What if?" "He won't," she interrupted, her hands sliding down to his chest. "Because we'll be careful. And because I want this, Alex. I want you." His breath hitched, and she could feel the way his body responded to her words. "Stepmother, I—" "Don't call me that," she said, her tone sharp but not unkind.
Not now.
"Not when we're like this." He hesitated, then nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Diana." The sound of her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine, and she leaned in to kiss him again, harder this time. Her hands were everywhere, exploring, caressing, igniting a fire that had been smoldering for far too long. "We'll make him pay," she murmured against his lips. "And we'll enjoy every second of it." Alex's hands found the hem of her dress, and he hesitated for a moment before pulling it up, his fingers brushing against her bare skin. "Is this really okay?" She grabbed his hand, guiding it lower, until his fingers were pressed against the heat of her core. "Does that feel okay to you?" His breath came in short, sharp gasps, and she could feel the way his body trembled against hers. "God, Diana." She smiled, a wicked, knowing smile, and leaned in to whisper in his ear. "Then stop thinking. And take what's yours." John's heart pounded in his chest as he watched them from the shadows, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had followed Diana and Alex outside, his gut churning with suspicion after their earlier confrontation. Now, as he stood hidden behind the thick trunk of an oak tree, he could see them clearly under the pale glow of the street lamp.
His wife.
His stepson. Their bodies pressed together, their lips locked in a kiss that made his stomach turn. Alex's hands were on Diana's hips, pulling her closer, and she was responding eagerly, her fingers tangled in his hair. John's breath caught in his throat, a mix of rage and disbelief surging through him.
How could they?
This wasn't just a moment of weakness, it was deliberate, intentional. They were lost in each other, oblivious to the world around them, and John felt the ground beneath him shift as the reality of what he was witnessing sank in. He took a step forward, his shoes crunching on the gravel path, but they didn't notice. Diana let out a soft moan, muffled by Alex's mouth, and John froze, his chest tightening. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but there was no rational explanation. This was wrong.
So wrong.
And yet, they didn't seem to care. "Diana," John finally said, his voice low and trembling with barely controlled fury. The sound of his voice snapped them apart like a whip. Diana's eyes widened, her face paling as she turned to face him. Alex stumbled back, his hands falling to his sides, his expression a mix of guilt and defiance. "John," Diana murmured, her voice shaky. I can explain." "Explain?" John barked, stepping closer, his fists still clenched. "Explain what, exactly? I just saw you with her stepson. What the hell is going on?" Alex took a step forward, his jaw tight. "Dad, it's not what you think." "Not what I think." John's voice rose, his eyes blazing. "I saw you with my own eyes, Alex. You were kissing her. Your mother. How the hell do you explain that?" Diana reached out, her hand trembling as she touched John's arm. "John, please, let's talk about this inside. Not here." He jerked his arm away, his face contorted with anger. "Not here? You think this is the time for privacy? You think I'm going to just sweep this under the rug like it's nothing?" "Dad." Alex started, but John cut him off with a sharp glare. Don't even try to justify this, Alex. This is sick. Do you understand that? Sick." Diana's eyes filled with tears, but she straightened her shoulders, her voice steady despite the fear in her expression. "John, I know this is shocking, but it's not what you think. It's complicated." "Complicated?" John let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, I'd say it's complicated. My wife and my stepson, my own blood, betraying me like this. That's more than complicated, Diana. That's F up." Alex clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "You don't get to act like the victim here, Dad. Not after what you did." John's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "What I did?"
What are you talking about?
Diana stepped between them, her hands raised as if to physically hold them apart. John, Alex knows about you and Emily. About your affair. John's face went slack, his anger momentarily replaced by shock.
What? How?
Stepmother told me, Alex said, his voice hard. And you know what? I don't give a damn about your excuses. You broke this family long before we did. John shook his head, his chest heaving. That's not the same. What you're doing is, it's unnatural. It's disgusting. Diana's eyes flashed with anger, her voice sharp. Don't you dare act like you're the moral authority here, John. You lied to me for years. You slept with my best friend. And now you want to judge us? John stared at her, his mind reeling. He wanted to argue, to lash out, but the truth in her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had failed as a husband, as a father. But this was something else entirely. So what now? He asked, his voice hollow. You're just going to what? Run off together? Pretend this is normal? Alex stepped forward, his eyes locking with John's. It's not about being normal. It's about feeling something real. Something that's been missing for a long time. John shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Real? This isn't real, Alex. It's a twisted fantasy. And it's going to destroy everything. It already has, Diana said softly, her eyes glistening with tears.
Hon, I'm sorry.
For everything. But I can't keep living like this. Pretending to be something I'm not. John looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the woman she had become. Someone he barely recognized. The woman he had married was gone, replaced by this stranger. So that's it, he asked, his voice breaking. You're just giving up? Diana shook her head, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face.
No.
I'm choosing to live.
To feel.
Even if it's messy. Even if it's wrong. John turned to Alex, his expression torn. And you? You're okay with this? With her? Alex met his father's gaze, without flinching. I love her, Dad. More than I've ever loved anyone. And I'm not going to let you or anyone take that away from me. John stared at them, his chest aching with a pain he couldn't describe. His family was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The life he had built, the future he had imagined, it was all gone. And in its place was this nightmare. He took a step back, his voice barely above a whisper. Then go. Both of you. Get out of my sight. Diana hesitated, her eyes filled with sorrow. John, go, he repeated, his voice breaking. Before I say something I regret. Alex reached for Diana's hand, his grip firm despite the tension in the air. Come on, stepmother. Let's go. She nodded, her shoulders slumping as she turned away from John. They walked down the path, their steps slow but purposeful, and John watched them until they disappeared into the darkness. He stood there for a long time, his mind racing, his heart heavy. The silence around him was deafening, and he felt more alone than he ever had in his life. But as he turned to go back inside, a thought crept into his mind. A dark, insidious thought that he couldn't ignore. What if they're right? What if this is what they need? He shook his head, trying to rid himself of the idea, but it lingered, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. He had always believed in right and wrong, in black and white. But now, everything was gray, and he didn't know where he stood anymore. As he closed the door behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was spiraling out of control. And for the first time, he didn't know if he could stop it.